Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View, and over the next couple hours, we're going to cover a lot of different topics. I didn't think we'd get into China, but there's some reasons for that, and that is, what is China doing right now to force Christians to renounce their faith? Then we also have what is happening in the Houston consulate for the Chinese government, so we'll get into that. Of course, we have been spending some time talking about Portland. We won't spend a lot of time today, but a very good piece by Rich Lowry, which we will focus on. School closures. Many people are arguing are anti-science, and that comes from former Senator Jim DeMint, who also was for some time the head of the Heritage Foundation, has written about that. And we'll get into some other aspects of the coronavirus, including a raid on the treatment that is being used right now for COVID patients, which we'll get into shortly. And so those are all just a few topics we'll put on the page here today. I'm going to be talking in just a minute about Hope Coffee, which I think you're going to enjoy. Next hour, Tim Mahoney is going to be with us. We will talk about the Red Sea Miracle. That has been a series that he has done on patterns for evidence. The Red Sea Miracle number 1 came out a couple of months ago. Red Sea Miracle number 2 is out, and we want to talk about that as well. And then we'll get into some other issues of reaching out to teenagers and how we can minister to them. That comes from Daniel Sanabria, which we'll talk about in the third hour. So just a lot of things to cover. But let me, if I can, introduce the president of Hope Coffee. I think it'll be more obvious in just a minute on how this coffee company has really had an outreach for missions. It is something that Brian Masters began back in 2010. And even to this day, you can actually find individuals that have the Hope Coffee Shop, one at Dallas Theological Seminary, just down the road from us. And this is an organization that has used the prophets in a gospel-focused kind of focused kind of idea in terms of social justice projects that have been implemented in Honduras, Guatemala, Mexico, and others. So, Brian, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby. It's great to be with you.
Talk about the vision for this. A lot of it is tied into Micah 6:8, to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. But talk about how you have this vision of using a coffee company in some ways to really expand the outreach that you have today in terms of some of these Latin American countries.
Yes, absolutely. We have certainly enjoyed not only serving great quality coffee, but being able to use the prophets to work into that vision of acting justly and loving mercy and walking humbly. And we're able to do that through empowering our coffee farmers of paying them higher than the market wages through direct relationships that we have with them as we purchase their wonderful coffee and import it into the United States and roast it and sell it here to customers of all different types here across the United States. And then as we do that, we're able to love mercy by using those profits to provide clean water for families or safe shelter or education programs for different families. And in those different countries, it looks a little bit different in each country. But through that, we're able to walk humbly because it's not us as Americans doing that work, but it's the national believers that we're partnering with who are going out and sharing the gospel as they are doing these projects and building relationships in a very unique way that allows them to share the gospel that way. So that's part of our vision of what we're doing.
One of the things I've been so impressed with is I've seen a number of coffee companies and coffee outfits in one way or another. I'm very familiar with St. Frank's in San Francisco, has been written up, and some others, which all have the idea that, we're not just going to take the beans and just ignore where they come from. We're going to have a relationship with those individuals. Now, you would assume that would always be the case, but I think we all know that some of the individuals that produce these very expensive sneakers that some of these NBA players are going to be wearing are done in sweatshops and all the rest. But I've been impressed by those of you that have kind of a biblical view and a biblical worldview and a desire to reach out to not just say, well, I just take the beans and make coffee. I'm going to have a relationship and a ministry with those people that are actually producing something we drink every day.
Yes, it is a very unique thing that's not just unique to Hope Coffee. There are many others that are having those kind of direct relationships with those farmers, and it's great where you can meet Rodamero and know what he's doing in Honduras and see the impact that he's having in the culture around him as he shares the gospel with people that he hires to help pick the coffee. And he knows from year to year that we're going to continue to buy coffee from him at those prices, and that gives him the confidence to continue to produce the coffee, but also knowing that as he's doing that, it provides income for him and for the surrounding community, and the gospel witness is able to continue year after year in those communities, which, that's our heartbeat. We are a coffee company, but in some sense, we're almost kind of like a mission agency combination type thing.
Yes, well, and again, this gives you, I guess the best term is what you talk about on your website, a direct trade relationship. By knowing these individuals. It's, again, a sad commentary, but most of us do not know any of the individuals that provide food for us or drink for us every single day. I occasionally get out into the farms and see some of that, but it's pretty rare, and what you've done is really, in a sense, have that. And there's a way in which on the website, as I understand, people can actually meet the farmers. Talk about that, if you might.
Oh, certainly, yes. In Honduras, you can see Rodamero and Nelson. Those are the two gentlemen that we buy coffee from year after year, and they're in the Siguatepeque region of Honduras there. Great families to be able to meet and see what they're doing, learn from them, and we've got stories periodically that we're able to communicate of things that they're engaged in their community. And then the Levis family in Guatemala as well. They're a wonderful family that, they're importing or growing the coffee, and we're working with them as they import the coffee here. And they're also doing education programs for the kids of the coffee farmers in that community that they're in Guatemala. And it's a neat way that our customers can see who is growing the coffee, the families that they're helping, and it's a very unique product to be able to taste it and go, hey, I know here's the person that grew that.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, I want to talk a little bit more about, again, how when you are buying, say, your coffee or others that are doing this, you're really, in a sense, sharing the gospel. And even today, the person that was the guest host for Rush Limbaugh was talking about how he's no longer going to get coffee from a very well-known coffee group because of not only the various political issues that are associated with that, but even some of the other things that were very irritating to him. And sometimes Christians say, if I am going to buy a product, I'd rather buy it from an individual that is going to be an individual that I agree with on terms of some issues, and especially if this is something that's going to support the sharing of the gospel. So when we come back, I want to talk about that a little bit, and talk about some of the various aspects of housing and clean water and education that you're involved with. And if you find yourself saying, I didn't know anything about this, so Hope Coffee, it's hopecoffee.com. We've got some information there. It has information about the products, some of which we have around here. Also has the mission and even how you might want to get started if you're interested. And then just the partners are individuals that we've interviewed on this program on a regular basis. And I think you'll be very impressed when you go to the website. And you, of course, can find that on the website, pointofview.net. So Brian Masters with us. We'll continue our conversation with him right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
How should the academic world respond when a research study published in a peer-reviewed journal comes to a conclusion that you wouldn't expect? In the past, some might challenge the methodology or even consider doing a second study to see if the conclusions could be replicated. The latest tactic is to bring pressure on the researchers and their universities so they will disavow their own study. That is what happened to professors at Michigan State University and the University of Maryland who studied police shootings. They analyzed 917 fatal police shootings of civilians to test whether the race of the officer or the civilian predicted fatal police shootings. Neither did. Their study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences found that once race-specific rates of violent crime were taken into account, they found no disparities based on race. Heather McDonald cited the study in her congressional testimony and also referred to this article in some of her writings. Even though this was challenged by other professors, the two professors in their original study concluded that even under the proposed study design, there was no significant evidence of anti-black disparity in the likelihood of being fatally shot by police. Given the current climate, you can imagine the amount of pressure they have been under. Earlier this month, the authors decided to retract their paper under the excuse that its conclusions had been misused. They specifically mentioned op-eds by Heather McDonald. This retraction illustrates what's wrong with the academic world. No longer is the focus on finding the truth. Political consensus is already driving much of the research done in this country. Researchers will likely suppress any results that challenge the latest liberal progressive narrative. Truth will be set aside. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Brian Masters, who is, of course, with Hope Coffee. And you can go to hopecoffee.com to find out a little bit more. And again, a lot of the theme runs around Micah 6:8, to act justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly. Let's, if we can, talk about mercy for just a minute, because as we go to your website, you've got one of your more recent posts here about a safe shelter. And it relates to this whole idea of housing. And, of course, even as we talk about the relationship you have there, as we've talked about missions, Brian, so often we say, you know, the lockdown and the pandemic has been, for some, an inconvenience, maybe even devastating if you lost your job. But for people that don't have any steady source of income, it has been a disaster. And so by providing this avenue for them to know that they will get paid and that you have a direct trade relationship, that's good enough. But then you've gone a step further and said, we want to provide safe housing, we want to provide clean water, we want to provide education. Talk about how that happens.
Well, certainly. This story that you related to is one that we really enjoy being able to share because of what God is doing in that. Part of what we're doing is we are hiring local believers to make sure that the funds that we are giving to those projects are spent correctly and that are impacting the families there. And so Pastor Carlos was able to meet with another pastor there in that community who knew this family. And this was back in February before the lockdown took place in Honduras. And the father of this family really did not trust believers or trust Christians at all. He'd seen a lot of things in his life and did not want to believe what they were telling him. And through the course of multiple months, as they were able to meet with them and begin to build a house for them, he was hearing the gospel. And then as they were in lockdown through COVID-19, they were allowed out 3 hours on one day a week. And now it's actually locked down to 3 hours every 2 weeks they're allowed out. And that is totally devastating when you can't work in these cultures. You're not able to provide food for your family.
That's
and
right.
so we were able to get a collection of funds to be able to send to provide food. And as they delivered food to those villages, there were 27 people that trusted Christ one weekend, and a couple weekends later, 10 more trusted Christ. And from that group were 4 people from this particular family that they're building a home for. And that is part of the power of the gospel, of people seeing that, our value of love, mercy, the fact that we are caring for people in the midst of their need, and sharing the gospel in the process of that as we build a relationship with them. And that's the core of who we are.
And I might just mention, if you go to the website, you have a whole section on your latest impact. You have the 37, which is one we just mentioned a minute ago. Then you have one on one safe shelter for new believers, and so they were some of those. But even before that, you have various stories about feeding the hungry in Honduras, the faces of Guatemala, and so much more. So again, this is just a great opportunity to share the gospel, and you really are just seeing a number of people accepting Jesus Christ, because in some respects you're the hands and feet of Jesus, aren't you?
Yes, and that's a fantastic thing, is that the local believers there and church leaders are sharing the gospel in those communities in ways that we couldn't as Americans. And it's wonderful to be able to help support them in those efforts and use the profits that God is providing through that. And with COVID-19, we know this is not going to be a banner year of sales for us. For any company, it won't be.
That's right.
And yet it could be one of those years that God provides a spiritual fruit beyond what we've ever seen before. And that gives us so much comfort knowing that we're following what God wants us to do as a company.
Let's talk about how some of our listeners can come alongside you, because obviously you're working through the local churches in those various countries, and you have service projects and things of that nature, and you do travel down there. And of course, I know we're all locked down, but eventually that might change. So I would assume there's a way that people could come with you. Certainly there's a way that people can support you. And of course, one way they support you is by your coffee, your tea, or a variety of other things. So how can our listeners who are saying, this is fascinating, I didn't know any about this Hope Coffee until just now, when they go to the website, where would you direct them, and what can they do to help you out?
Certainly. Right on the bottom section of our website, you'll see coffee and products. You can purchase coffee there. There's home subscriptions. There are small group bundles if you're meeting in a small house church or a Sunday school class or Bible study type things. We've got coffee and tea and different things. And then we have subscription programs for churches and businesses for different discounts and monthly subscriptions and things that they can sign up for. And prior to COVID-19, we weren't quite there, but we were nearing the 500 churches across the United States that are serving Hope Coffee. And that's where we're able to see the body of Christ come together and unite for a common cause of sharing the gospel in these different communities. And so they can certainly go there and see at hopecoffee.com the different products and things. And it is available. A limited selection of products are available on Amazon. If you prefer to purchase through Amazon, you can find Hope Coffee there as well. But those are a few of the places that you can go and see what we've got available.
Just before we go, let's, if I can, maybe have you share your vision, because what you were able to do is say, I can actually put together a business which actually can then advance the gospel. And so what might you say? Because in some respects, people think, well, the only way I can do the gospel is go to Dallas Theological Seminary or go to a Bible college and then go into ministry. And yet here you're doing a ministry in some respects through an entrepreneurial activity. What would you say to others that might want to follow you in the same kind of venture, maybe in a different area or a different service?
Absolutely. Look at what God has given you and the skill set and abilities, and look at those people in your own neighborhoods that you need to build a relationship with. One reason we don't send teams to build a house in a weekend type thing is we want the local believers to build a relationship over time. to be able to earn the right to be heard of the gospel and know that they care for them. The same is true here in the United States, where we build those relationships with people and communities around us. And so if you're running a business, those vendors and their customers are the people that God is providing for you to have those relationships with, and to begin to build those and learn how to turn those conversations into spiritual conversations. And my wife was just reading a book called Stay Salty, and she was telling me about, I have not actually read this, and yet the conversations that she's having with me and then be able to have with our people in our neighborhood and elsewhere really drive home that focus of we need to be the salt and light of the gospel here in the United States and elsewhere. And so through your business, you're able to do that. We are looking for a vision in the future to be able to have Hope Coffee shops in other locations across the United States and eventually internationally to be able to serve others in those types of ways as well.
Well, again, if you want to contact Brian Masters, we have a link to hopecoffee.com. Also have a link to his Facebook page and the Twitter posts, and you will find all the information you need. And I would encourage you to find out a little bit more. And if nothing else, I hope this provides you with a vision that helps you understand that whatever God has placed in your hand, whatever gifts you have, you can use those for the advancement of the gospel, even something as simple as coffee. So, Brian, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, thank you, Kerby. It's been a joy.
Again, we have that link to hopecoffee.com, and everything you would possibly need should be right there, so I hope you'll take the time to find that out. And when we come back from the break, we're going to spend some time getting into a couple of issues in the news, but let me just mention real quickly that my Viewpoints commentary today is entitled Disavowed Study. And in some respects, it's a little bit similar to some of the things I shared even yesterday, this so-called self-cancel culture. You know, there are people that are starting to say, well, I should maybe just stop doing what I'm doing because I don't have a right. And this is sort of similar to it, but it's something that's really interesting because I asked the question, how should the academic world respond when a research study published in a peer-reviewed journal comes to a conclusion you wouldn't expect? Well, in the past, some might challenge the methodology, even consider doing a second study. But the latest tactic is simply bring pressure on the researchers and the universities to disavow their own study. And this was a study that appeared in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. But basically what it found is there was really no disparities in the police force in the way in which they interacted with individuals of different races in terms of police shootings. Well, as you might imagine, that's something that a person like Heather McDonald, who's been on this program before and is a fellow with the Manhattan Institute and wrote a book called The War on Cops, picked up on. And because, you know, you've had some people that said, you know, really there is not systemic racism in a lot of these police departments. That goes against the politically correct ideas. So these individuals were forced to disavow their own study and withdraw their own study, even though they still stand by the accuracy of it. But it just illustrates again how political consensus is driving a lot of the research, and now even more so how researchers will likely suppress any results that challenge the liberal progressive narrative. So if you want to read more about that, it's the Viewpoints commentary today. We have a lot more to talk about right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
We'll spend some time, if we can, talk about the pandemic and some of the politics associated with it. Not the least of which is, of course, Nancy Pelosi is now calling it the Trump virus, so we've already picked that up a couple of minutes ago. And it might also be worth mentioning that not only are people picking on the president, but various governors. You have a couple of situations now in which obituaries are being posted, in which they actually, in the obituary, if you can believe this, this criticize the governors. Now, the governors that get criticized, I'm going to mention Texas Governor Greg Abbott, Arizona Governor Doug Ducey. I don't remember any conservatives criticizing Governor Cuomo, given the fact that there are 32,000 people that have died in New York, in large part because he allowed and even ordered individuals that were COVID positive into the nursing homes. And still, the largest deaths by deaths per 100,000 are in places like New York and New Jersey. But, individuals that are saddened about losing their loved one never thought about using an obituary to criticize the governor. But let's use a couple of examples here. There are just a few that I'll mention. One is Fiona Tulip, who was concerned about the fact that after her mother, or in this particular case, I guess it was the stepmother, died, that in this particular obituary, she says her undeserving death is due to the carelessness of the politicians who continue to hedge their bets on the lives of healthcare workers. I won't even go into some of it. It's just amazing to me that you would put this in an obituary, and specifically targets Texas Governor Greg Abbott, and then even invites Governor Abbott to the burial to witness firsthand the tragedy of my brother and I and our incredible mother who gave her life to save others. I guess it was a mother. I've got a couple of these, so I might have conflated a few. That's one example. Let me take one out of Arizona just to illustrate the point. An Arizona woman invited the governor in Arizona there to her father's funeral earlier this month and cast blame. Again, these are in these obituaries on the terrible leadership, failure to require masks, and all of the rest. So we are starting to see another tactic, which I just can't even get my head around, but that's what's happening right now, in which everything is politicized. We can't call it the China virus, but we certainly can have people call it the Trump virus. And of course, it's all happening in a political campaign, so I guess we should expect no less. Let me get into another issue, because this shows you, if nothing else, what might happen indeed if Democrat leaders actually are able to control not only the House, which they do right now, but the Senate and the Oval Office. Because one of the more effective treatments, now I'm talking about treatments, not a vaccine, but one of the more effective treatments for COVID patients is out of Gilead, which is called remdesivir. And we've talked about this before. As a matter of fact, on Friday, we're going to have Dr. Merrill Matthews here. We'll probably go into this in more detail. And the editors of the Wall Street Journal referred to this as the raid on remdesivir, which is a treatment for individuals that are COVID positive, okay? And they now are seeing that a number of Democrat leaders, this would be Elizabeth Warren, be Bernie Sanders, and a number, there's at least half a dozen Senate Democrats, actually have sent a letter to the Department of Health and Human Services arguing that the Trump administration acquired this particular supply of remdesivir at an exorbitant cost and allowed Gilead Sciences to reap revenues because of that. Now, the editors point out that the complaint is false, but they go on to say it's worth dissecting in some detail because it shows the left's sweeping plan for the government to control drug prices and even pharmaceutical manufacturing. If you read right now some of the things that have been said by Elizabeth Warren, Senator Elizabeth Warren, Senator Bernie Sanders, which I am sure are going to make their way into the Democratic platform, and were part of the attempt to pass legislation to punish pharmaceutical organizations and companies, they actually want to strip out the right of various companies to own a patent. Matter of fact, this particular letter says they want the government to seize patents for drugs that result from any publicly funded research and development, and license them to a generic manufacturer for production at lower cost. And so here's the situation. Food and Drug Administration authorized remdesivir in May for emergency use in hospitals because after a very significant number of studies, they found that it reduced the time to recover by many days. And it also showed a 31% decline in mortality. And so in some respects, it was shown to be a very effective treatment. As a matter of fact, you've noticed that the death rate has gone down. Part of that is because they've learned some things about ventilators and about various kinds of treatments. Hydroxychloroquine would be another one, but remdesivir is one of those. And so in some respects, the research done by Gilead Sciences themselves released more data showing that severely ill patients treated with this were 62% less likely to die than patients with similar characteristics and the same disease severity. So this one has turned out to be very effective. So given the fact that no good action can go unpunished, now you have the Senate Democrats that say that we want to punish it because the United States government will pay the same price for these drugs as foreign countries, but privately insured Americans will pay a little bit more through higher premiums. But I love what the editors say. Never mind that by shortening hospital stays, remdesivir will save insurers, hospitals, and patients thousands of dollars for every particular case. Hospitals on average spend $2,500 or actually charge $2,500 per day for inpatient. And so again, a particular pharmaceutical company have explained that private insurers will pay more because regulations require drug makers to give government programs a hefty discount off the wholesale price. These mandatory government discounts are one reason for the high list price for some drug makers charge when actually relatively few people actually pay. And so what you are having right now is a desire to see if we can punish a particular agency, in this case a pharmaceutical company, which has provided a drug that is actually shortening the hospital stays and saving lives. If you think it's still one of those evil big pharma, here's one more piece in the article, and then we'll move on. And that is Gilead has already licensed remdesivir to 5 generic manufacturers at no cost and to make and sell it in 127 developing countries. As the editors point out, they didn't have to do this, but he expects the development and manufacturing cost by the end of the year to exceed, are you ready for this number? $1 billion, including exploring an inhaled formulation that would let patients be treated outside of hospitals. So again, I know nothing about this particular manufacturer or this particular pharmaceutical company other than it seems to have been very successful. And yet, look what is the reaction from at least 6 of these Democrat senators. We want to punish this pharmaceutical company, which is actually going out of its way right now to save lives. One more piece I might just mention. The editors of National Review have said, the president has not been doing a very good job of answering the questions about COVID-19. They say one of the more damaging interviews President Trump has ever given was the one he gave on Sunday to Chris Wallace, in which he kept talking about the fact that the number of cases of COVID-19 are going up simply because of testing. Well, that's only partially true. Had trouble answering a lot of the questions, and if nothing else, maybe somebody in the Trump administration finally got to him, because yesterday, if you noticed, when they once again implemented those 5 p.m. updates on the coronavirus task force, he was willing to, I think, much more honestly acknowledge that it's going to get worse before it gets better. I know that just runs against his personality. I know he wants to try to look ahead, try to provide positive, hopeful kinds of analysis, but not acknowledging what is actually happening right now on the ground has certainly hurt his credibility. And one more evidence that sometimes he almost like he doesn't really want to be reelected. Nevertheless, that is one of the other issues I wanted to put on the table. And when we come back, we have a couple of other issues to address as well, because there is a lot to cover. And then in the next hour, don't forget, we are going to have Tim Mahoney with us, Red Sea Miracles, and of course, an individual that over these years, through his Thinking Man films, have talked about different patterns of evidence. And we've learned a lot more about the book of Exodus and a lot more about archaeology and history of the ancient Near East from him. So we'll cover some of that in the next hour with him, but we need to take a break. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
You know, this week we've been talking about China, and I thought, well, maybe today we won't. Well, I guess we will. And the reason for that is pretty simple, and that is the United States has ordered China to close its diplomatic consulate in Houston by Friday. And the reason is it's citing a nationwide pattern of espionage and even an attempted theft of scientific research that was aided by the diplomats. This shouldn't surprise you, but let me try to give some background. First of all, this week we've talked about China. I've got a commentary coming out on Monday, which I remind us of all sorts of things. And by the way, when I talk about China, I always have to say we're talking about the Chinese Communist Party. Some people say, you just hate the Chinese people. No, we love the Chinese people. They have almost no control over what their communist leaders are doing. But earlier in this week, we talked about how the FBI director, Christopher Wray, gave this very shocking presentation about the fact that nearly half of the counter counterintelligence cases that the FBI is working on have to do with China. Their frequent counterattacks, their predatory practices, their economic espionage, which is the issue right here. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo warned the Chinese leaders to back down from their military actions in South China Sea. We've also talked about the Attorney General William Barr, not only just critical of the government there, but also the way in which Hollywood and big tech have aided this. And as I pointed out just the other day, we actually have a law for Chinese students that come over to this country. And there's hundreds of thousands that have come here. And they are required to actually provide information to China. So you have to recognize that anyone that is here from China, especially the diplomats in the consulate, are in a sense almost spy agents by definition. And you might think, well, that's a little harsh to say about all these nice Chinese students that I've met through international ministries and things of that nature. And they may be very nice individuals. But again, ask yourself this fundamental question. If you're a Chinese student that wants to study in the United States, do you think that the Communist Party in China is going to allow you to come over here if you're not also going to do what you can to help China? I mean, think that through for just a minute. But nevertheless, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was at a news conference actually in Copenhagen, Denmark at the time, but he actually said that Chinese citizens have been stealing intellectual property. That is certainly the case. And there's just an incredible amount. Even Christopher Wray was pointing out that just the economic espionage alone has resulted in the largest transfers of wealth in human history. And he goes on to say, Mike Pompeo now goes on to say, we're setting out clear expectations as to how the Chinese Communist Party is going to behave. And when they don't, we're going to take actions to protect the American people, protect our security, our national security, and also our economy and jobs. Now, recognize that the embassy is in Washington, D.C. Then you have, I believe it's 7 different consulates. One is in Houston. But think about Houston. Most of our listeners right now are in the state of Texas. Think about what's in Houston. Well, that would be like NASA. That would be all sorts of oil and gas. That would be a lot of high tech. You can see that that would be just an ideal place to actually try to steal any intellectual property. The other day, we saw that China was trying to steal information about these vaccines that are being produced for the coronavirus. And so another individual, the Assistant Secretary for East Asia and Pacific, again, I assume with the State Department, said that the People's Liberation Army has been sending students both overtly and otherwise to American universities to study things to advance their own warfare advantages in the economic world and the rest. And so that's why we took the practical step to prevent them from doing this. I suspect that some of these Chinese students might be encouraged to go back to their country of origin as well. So every day there's another story out of China. The one I was going to cover until we had this one from the Houston consulate is this very good piece by Ryan Saavedra. China forces Christians to renounce their faith, destroy Christian symbols, or be cut off from welfare. And that is, again, the Chinese Communist Party. I want to be clear, we're talking about the communists here, is forcing people of faith to renounce their belief and replace their religious symbols and imagery with portraits of Chairman Mao and President Xi Jinping. This is a report that comes from a publication of the U.S. Department of State, describes what is happening in terms of religious liberty and human rights in China. A number of months ago, Chinese officials in one particular province called officials from all the local towns and villages under its governance for a meeting, and the participants were told at that meeting they were ordered to remove crosses, religious symbols, and images from the homes of people of faith who receive social welfare payments and replace them with portraits of Chairman Mao and President Xi Jinping. The officials were then instructed to annul the subsidies to any of those individuals that would protest that order. A member of the church there told the publication that the communist officials tore down religious writings and a calendar of Jesus in a home and replaced it with the image of Mao Zedong, of course, the most murderous dictator in world history. The communist official reportedly told the person impoverished religious households can't receive money from the state for nothing. They must obey the Communist Party for the money they receive. And a preacher from a house church received a visit from the local officials in May. They removed a cross and images of Jesus from his home and posted a portrait of Mao. All the impoverished households in the town were told to display Mao images. The government, of course, is trying to eliminate any kind of belief, and they want, if nothing else, for them to no longer believe in Jesus Christ. So you can kind of see where this has happened. There are also reports, of course, of the treatment, as we've talked about on this program before, of the treatment of Muslims, which include being taken to concentration camps and being subjected to forced labor. And then, of course, you have a variety of other individuals that are now being critical of any kind of Christian faith. One of the statements was, Jesus Christ won't drag you out of poverty or cure your illnesses, but the Chinese Communist Party will. So take down those pictures of Christ and put up nice pictures of President Xi Jinping. That's what thousands of villagers in southeastern China have been told by local officials, in a sign really of just a growing cult of personality around the country's powerful leader. And so this is just another one of those stories that is coming out of China, and just, I think, a reminder of what we are dealing with today in China. Before we take a break, let me just mention that in a new book coming out, and in a very good article by Daniel Blumenthal and Nicholas Eberstein, they pointed out that they actually are convinced that the Chinese Communist Party is now more powerful than it was even during the time of Mao. And so we're going to have to really have a serious conversation about China. And all of this is happening in a political year in which we can give you all sorts of statements by former Vice President Joe Biden, who said China's not that much of an enemy. As a matter of fact, when his son received tremendous benefits from China, we know his reaction to China is going to be to turn a blind eye or even to lay down. And that's very different than President Donald Trump, in which he has challenged China on everything from trade issues to human rights issues. So I think this should be an issue of a foreign policy discussion this year during the presidential campaign. And not only should you be asking about what the presidential nominees actually believe, but what the United States Senate believes as well, because they may or may not want to ratify various trade agreements or treaties that affect China. So I think those are some questions you should be asking, especially during this election year. Let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to get into some of the articles we've posted on the website. Then we're going to be talking with our friend Tim Mahoney about the Red Sea miracle. All of that you can find on our website, which is pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
(2020). It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. They're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Wednesday edition here of Point of View, and I am so grateful that you could join us today. Over the next 2 hours, we're going to cover a lot of topics, and as always, we'll try to hopefully make it interesting and educate you about some very important topics. In about a half an hour, for example, we'll be talking with Tim Mahoney. He is the director, as well as really the producer, of what has become known as the Patterns for Evidence series. More recently, you might have seen the Red Sea Miracle Part 1 in the theaters. Of course, since the theaters are closed down, Red Sea Miracle Part 2 is out, so we're going to talk about how you can watch it if you have not already done so. And I think we always learn a great deal about ancient Near East history, about archaeology, about the book of Exodus, and much, much more. So I'm looking forward to that. We also are going to be talking about addressing the needs of at-risk teens in the next hour. Daniel Sanabria, who is actually with Youth for Christ, will be talking about that. I've posted a couple of articles, one which I'm going to get to in just a minute, by Rich Lowry. Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats have it exactly wrong on the feds versus protesters in Portland. Didn't want to spend a lot of time talking about Portland. We have done that over the last couple of days and tried to educate you on that issue and how to think about that and why you need to exercise some discernment. But this Rich Lowry piece was so well written that I decided to post it. A few hours later, I saw it was showing up on all sorts of websites, so I guess I wasn't the only one that thought maybe it was kind of a good summary of that. We also, of course, been following this whole idea of reopening the schools. And so a former U.S. Senator, Jim DeMint, who represented South Carolina, later was the head of the Heritage Foundation, is now the chairman of the Conservative Partnership Institute, has written a piece called Why School Closures Are Anti-Science. And this week we've been talking a great deal about China. I think we'll have to come back to that, if not this hour, next hour, because now the United States government has ordered China to close its diplomatic consulate in Houston. Again, for your information, you have the Chinese embassy in Washington, D.C., and then around the country, you have about 7 different consulates. This one has been accused of a pattern of espionage and stealing scientific research and stealing intellectual property and a variety of other topics. So there's just a lot to cover, and we will try to get all of that in and maybe even get into a few other issues. I noticed our people that have gone over to Parler have said, well, a good illustration of why maybe you need to leave Twitter is Twitter now has banned, I'm not making this up, it sounds like it's out of the Onion, Twitter has banned Star of David images on Twitter as hateful. So we'll get into that as well, which is why you're starting to see an exodus of some people from Twitter to other venues in social media. So we'll get to all sorts of topics along the way. And if I can certainly answer some of your questions, or if you'd like to join the conversation, you are welcome to do so. Well, Rich Lowry, you got to understand, he's sticking his tongue in his cheek a little bit. He's having a little bit of fun here. And he starts out by saying, if only mobs were allowed to destroy federal property without consequence, then there wouldn't have to be any dispute about federal agents defending a federal courthouse in Portland, Oregon. It simply could be overrun, burned to the ground with no unwelcome resistance from the government. Of course, he's obviously having some fun with that. But he says, as it is, the mayor of Portland, Ted Wheeler, we talked about him yesterday, presides over a city that has become a watchword over the years for left-wing thuggery, unchecked by municipal authorities, has roused himself into a state of high dudgeon over federal officers trying to counter ongoing assaults on a federal building. He calls the feds a direct threat to democracy and argues that they are engaged in unconstitutional arrests and inflaming protests that he would hope would have ended within a matter of days. That is an idle hope, I might point out. In case you're wondering, I think we're up to the 55th straight day. I may be off a day or two. After a while, you lose track. And, of course, he's not the only one. The senator from Oregon, Ron Wyden, actually said now Trump and Chad Wolf, you might say, who's he? Well, he's the acting director of the Department of Health, Homeland Security, have weaponized the DHS for their own occupying army to provoke violence on the streets of my hometown because they think it plays well with right-wing media. No, actually, as we posted yesterday, one of those articles, there were a number of people in Portland saying, we're glad you're here. This idiocy has got to stop. But nevertheless, the argument has been this all is going to wind down. And I love what Rich Lowry says. If Portland was on the verge of calm prior to the arrival of the feds in force, it would have been the first time since, of course, the killing of George Floyd, which was the spark that lit this fire. Now, protests have taken every single day since May 28th. He gives you a timeline by giving you some of the headlines there. May 29th, massive vigil for North Portland leads to declared riot downtown. May 30th, curfew imposed and ignored. June 30th, police building protest. Another riot was declared by the police. By the way, whenever they declare a riot, as I explained to you yesterday, is because the actual order that came down by the mayor, by the governor, and by even a federal judge is the only time you could use tear gas is if there was an actual declared riot. You can't use tear gas in any other situation. And, of course, it hamstringed and handcuffed all sorts of local law officials. So when you have the individuals which are actually given the responsibility to guard and protect federal buildings, that would be the Federal Protective Services, they aren't hamstringed by the same kinds of regulations. And so as a result, we're allowed to actually do some things because, as we've pointed out, and this article goes into it, protesters over the weekend took down fences put around the federal building, lit a fire in the building's entryway. As a statement by the Portland police put it, dozens of people with shields, helmets, gas masks, umbrellas, bats, hockey sticks approached the doors of the courthouse. That would be the Mark Hatfield Federal Courthouse. But surely it was just a misunderstanding. Again, Rich Lowry's having some fun with this, to believe that they had to repulse them with tear gas. And the only reason they were able to do so is because the local police finally declared that it was a riot, and that gave them the justification to do so. He says, this isn't hard. It is the people attacking a federal property who bear moral responsibility for what's happening in Portland, in all the cities around the country where mobs aren't trying to burn down symbols of our justice system. There's no enhanced presence of federal officers. But again, these are individuals that actually have the responsibility in a federal building. They're called the Federal Protective Services. If you've ever been in a federal building, you've walked right by them. So these are the individuals that have the responsibility to protect a federal building, just the way individuals like that and the Marines have a responsibility to protect an embassy in another country. And I'm not saying that Portland is another country, but if you saw what has happened so far, it sort of looks like what's happened to some of our embassies in other countries as well. We'll come back and finish a few comments about what is happening in Portland, and then move on to another topic, because there is a big question as to whether or not the schools will be open this fall. But if you look at the data and you look at what the science would say, you would say that opening the schools would be a good idea. But we'll come back and talk about that right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
How should the academic world respond when a research study published in a peer-reviewed journal comes to a conclusion that you wouldn't expect? In the past, some might challenge the methodology or even consider doing a second study to see if the conclusions could be replicated. The latest tactic is to bring pressure on the researchers and their universities so they will disavow their own study. That is what happened to professors at Michigan State University and the University of Maryland who studied police shootings. They analyzed 917 fatal police shootings of civilians to test whether the race of the officer or the civilian predicted fatal police shootings. Neither did. Their study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences found that once race-specific rates of violent crime were taken into account, they found no disparities based on race. Heather McDonald cited the study in her congressional testimony and also referred to this article in some of her writings. Even though this was challenged by other professors, the two professors in their original study concluded that even under the proposed study design, there was no significant evidence of anti-black disparity in the likelihood of being fatally shot by police. Given the current climate, you can imagine the amount of pressure they have been under. Earlier this month, the authors decided to retract their paper under the excuse that its conclusions had been misused. They specifically mentioned op-eds by Heather McDonald. This retraction illustrates what's wrong with the academic world. No longer is the focus on finding the truth. Political consensus is already driving much of the research done in this country. Researchers will likely suppress any results that challenge the latest liberal progressive narrative. Truth will be set aside. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Right, for a few more minutes, and then at the bottom of the hour, we're going to be talking with Tim Mahoney about a Red Sea miracle. I think you're going to really enjoy that conversation. Rich Lowry's piece is one of the pieces we have posted on the website, and I love the way he puts it at one point. He says, although the federal courthouse has done nothing to provoke protesters and has been standing on the same spot since 1997, it has been a constant target. Protesters have smashed its glass doors, covered its exterior with graffiti. I encourage you to don't trust my words for it. Look at it yourself. Just do a Google search. You'll be amazed at what you see there. And repeatedly have attempted to light it on fire. And so in some respects, the contrast right now has been, well, look at what the federal government has done. And the argument that was made the other day by some is maybe this is like the Pottery Barn situation. You break it, you own it. It was the argument that was used by the Secretary of State Colin Powell to George W. Bush. You know, if you go into Iraq, you're going to own Iraq. In the same place, some people are saying, you know, it might be just better to just back off, just let the Federal Protective Services try to defend the building and forget the rest, because what, of course, has happened, the Federal Protective Services has had to bring some other people from the Department of Homeland Security, people that are with the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, people that are part of the Department of Homeland Security with ICE to help them out. And then they have gone out to actually, in some cases, arrest individuals. Now, they're not necessarily wearing badges with their name, which is why you've had some people very critical of that. They've been using unmarked cars, basically not even police cars, partially because they want to avoid retaliation against the officers. If you can figure out who that individual is, especially if you don't have a common name like Smith or Jones, you might figure out where that person lives, and then the mob will show up at your home. Lest you think that would never happen, all you need to do is look at what we talked about yesterday with Tucker Carlson, or what we've talked about in the past with various governors and judges and other kinds of things. And so those are somewhat questionable, but still, according to Department of Homeland Security, the officers are wearing the insignia of the agencies and unique identifiers. But I think they could get rid of some of the camouflage and some of the others that make it too easy for people to criticize what is taking place. And of course, you have House Speaker Nancy Pelosi referring to these individuals as stormtroopers who are kidnapping protesters. Okay, well, let's take the individual that's mentioned most often, and that's the story of Mark Pettibone. You may not have heard his name, but almost everybody that is critical of what has happened up in Portland tend to tell his story, even if they don't know his name. Because he said, I was arrested. I was doing nothing wrong. I was arrested by federal agents. They took him to the federal courthouse, read him his Miranda rights, and released him because he really could give them no information. He wasn't detained indefinitely. He didn't disappear. He wasn't harmed in any way, but might have even been arrested in error, but then allowed to go his way because he looked too much like another individual they were trying to spot because of facial recognition software. So anyway, the bottom line is, as Rich Lowry says, it would be one thing if municipal authorities in Portland could legitimately claim that they have things under control. They don't. The mobs have been clashing with the local police for months. This long-standing riot is a stark commentary on the misgovernance of what is taking place there in Portland, reminiscent of what we saw in Seattle. And if nothing else, you should not be, I think, insulting the federal government for trying to protect a federal building. But nevertheless, when Donald Trump and the Attorney General Bill Barr and others began to get involved, I think it made for too easy an excuse to blame him or to blame the federal government or to blame the Department of Homeland Security, Chris Wolf, or whatever. I just think maybe if they can just pull back and say, okay, if you don't want our help, we won't help you. And let's actually begin to understand that the disaster that unfolded in Seattle was due to a governor and a mayor who were feckless. The disaster that's unfolded in Portland is due, again, to the disaster from what happened or is not happening from the Oregon governor and the mayor of Portland. But let's move on to some other issues, because certainly a bigger issue for you is whether your children or grandchildren are going to go to school in the fall. Looks to me like most people have made up their minds that they're going to keep the schools closed down. But if nothing else, it seems to me that if you look at the data, that's why I posted this very good piece by former Senator Jim DeMint. He pulls together some really good arguments. First of all, he points out that the director of the Centers for Disease Control said that having the schools actually closed is a greater health threat to the children than having them open. You had a survey done by the New York Times of more than 500 epidemiologists and infectious disease specialists, and they found that more than 70% of them would send their child to school, daycare, or camp immediately or later in the summer. Then you have the American Academy of Pediatrics, and you have the infectious disease specialist, William Raska, and Benjamin Lee, who actually co-authored a review of some of the most recent studies and the data worldwide in the official journal of the American Academy of Pediatrics called Pediatrics. You can go find it in your library. You can actually find it online. And here's their conclusion. I know it's fairly long, but it just helps you, again, hear from people that are pediatricians who probably know a lot about this, who are infectious disease specialists, and their conclusion was this, quote, almost 6 months into the pandemic, accumulating evidence and collective experience argue that children, particularly school-age children, are far less important drivers of SARS-CoV-2, which of course is the virus, transmission than adults. Therefore, serious consideration should be paid towards strategies that allow schools to remain open even during periods of COVID-19 spread. In doing so, we could minimize the potential profound adverse social, developmental, and health costs that our children will continue to suffer until an effective treatment or vaccine can be developed and distributed, or, failing that, until we reach herd immunity. So again, the point that they're making is that almost all the evidence suggests that this is the least dangerous for this particular age group, especially when you recognize that there are really significant needs, mental needs, needs of at-risk children, and all sorts of other things that is the case. Here's another one. We broadcast in the state of North Carolina, and here is Daniel Halperin, public health professor at the University of North Carolina, who actually said it's logical that schools should open in the fall and summer camps, if it's still possible, should open. I'm worried about my daughter driving, but I wouldn't keep her home because there's a 1 out of a million chance that she's going to die in a car accident. And so it's I think, helpful to recognize the facts and figures on the particular issues of what could happen if indeed we don't open the schools. And let's go to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. This is the cause of youth deaths from other causes in 2018. 21,000 Americans under the age of 25 died of suicide, more than 120 times more deadly than COVID-19. 15,000 youth died from unintentional injury. That's 88 times more deadly than COVID-19. And 5,500 youth died from homicide, which again is 30 times more deadly than COVID-19. Those are the ways young people are dying today, and the evidence is overwhelming. The seniors, especially those with prior health conditions, are vulnerable to COVID in ways that children are not. So if some of the teachers are older, maybe we still have to come up with some alternatives. That can be various kinds of video conferencing and the rest. But the reality is we used to think that these children were passing the disease on to their parents or grandparents. In many cases, they're now talking about children are a break rather than super spreaders. So we're learning a lot more than we have before. Unless you say, well, we should just do what other countries are doing. Well, if you go over to Europe right now, or you go over to Australia, you'll notice the schools are in session. So this is just another particular article that pulls together some really good facts and figures. I've only given you a few, but again, if you would like to read it, it is a piece entitled Why School Closures Are Anti-Science. Reopening the schools is the uncontroversial data-based scientific consensus among the world's medical and public health community. And it's written by the former senator from South Carolina, Jim DeMint, who is now the current chairman of the Conservative Partnership Institute. Just one resource I want to put on the table. I can understand why some parents and grandparents are still skittish, but if nothing else, the science seems to point in the other direction, and there are risks at staying at home just as there are risks in going to school. And if you start weighing the risks, you recognize reopening the schools makes a great deal of sense. Let's take a break, though. We're going to move into a different topic. Patterns of evidence, the Moses controversy, the Red Sea miracle, all that coming up right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, we're going to spend some time, hopefully, talking with Tim Mahoney. We'll get him on the program in just a few minutes. And again, director of the Patterns of Evidence, the Moses Controversy, Patterns of Evidence, the Exodus, and of course, Patterns of Evidence, now the Red Sea Miracle. And since the very beginning of his attempts to deal with some of these issues associated with the book of Exodus, we've had him on the program. And of course, as you are probably well aware, these films have been out for some time. You've probably seen many of them in the the various theaters, and perhaps even have some of the DVDs of that. The only real glitch has been the fact that we last time actually were able to probably buy out almost the entire theater for my own Sunday school class because so many people wanted to see it. So we saw, of course, the Patterns of Evidence Red Sea Miracle Part 1. But Part 2 was supposed to come out, and of course, you know the rest of the story. The pandemic has closed down the movie theaters, and so there has been a different way to get some of this information to you. And so I understand now we have Tim Mahoney with us. So again, we've been talking with him ever since Patterns of Evidence, the Moses Controversy, Patterns of Evidence, the Exodus, and now we're talking about Red Sea Miracle Part 2. So Tim, thanks for joining us once again here on Point of View.
Hey, it's great to be on the program again.
Let's again just remind people that this all began when you just really had kind of a crisis of faith and you started investigating the credibility of the Exodus and the conquest. And of course, now we're up to the whole idea of the Red Sea. And so in some respects, just give us kind of a thumbnail sketch of how you came to this, because this film series has been part of a almost 2 decades long experiment and investigation, hasn't it?
It has. Actually, I started at the Red Sea, and I thought that I was going to make this program back in 2002 on the Red Sea. And during that process, as we said, I had a crisis of faith when I went to Egypt, and they told me there's no evidence for the Israelites. And that began this 20-year journey, of which I'm thankful to have actually gotten to the end of this phase of the investigation. And so the Red Sea Miracle is actually a 2-part film series. It's over 4 hours of investigative documentary, footage of me tracing the route of the Exodus out of Egypt.
And again, we have promoted, of course, Red Sea Miracle Part 1. And as I was mentioned, just as we were getting you on the air here, that my Sunday school class bought out almost the entire one theater there with individuals that watched it. And we were ready. As a matter of fact, we had some people even buying tickets for Red Sea Miracle Part 2. But then the pandemic kind of changed everything, didn't it?
It certainly did. And in fact, it made it very difficult because we weren't able to even come to the office to edit because of the restrictions. And so we were in the process of finishing this film, but in some ways, it actually changed the film. We were able to continue on, but I shot more footage because I've included some of the unrest that has happened in our nation, from both the riots to the believe it or not to the pandemic, in the conclusion of the Red Sea Miracle Part 2.
So again, a lot of people might say, well, okay, I can't go into a theater, so I can't watch it. But you actually can. So talk about ways in which that's available. I do know a number of people that already have purchased some of the DVDs of the previous series. But if somebody wants to see Part 2, they've said, I've seen Part 1, and you kind of left us hanging a couple months ago. So how do we see Part 2? Explain that if you might.
Well, we're going to be going on a national campaign right now with SalemNow.com. That's coming up. That's going to be happening on Friday. Salem Now is a new platform with Salem Radio Network, SalemNow.com. That's the way that people will be able to see it for the next few weeks, and that's going to be released on Friday. And so that is, if they can wait till Friday, they can see it there. We do have some people coming to our own Patterns of Evidence website to watch the movie. But that's just going to be ending in the next 2 days here. So the best way is to basically, you can either go to Patterns of Evidence immediately, or you can go see it at SalemNow.com.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, one of the things our own Sunday school class was going to do is we're going to do one of those showings just for a small group based upon pulling it off of Patterns of Evidence. By the way, it's patternsofevidence.com. You don't need to remember all that because we have all those links on the website. But this is an opportunity for other people to see it as well. But because it is so long, it seems to me that I would hope most people would also think about not only watching it, but getting a video, a DVD or something of that nature, so that they could watch it in a more leisurely way, or also show it to their Sunday school class, maybe have a family night where everybody can gather together and show it over a series of times, because it is really striking to me what has happened. I think I'm not actually telling anything that you didn't already tell in the first version there, the first part of the Red Sea miracle, but you seem to have changed the mind of one or two of the skeptics that you interviewed in the past. Can you share that story?
Well, yes, and I don't know if I did it or if there was just more research that came along, but yes, in the very first film, Manfred Bitek, an Egyptologist who is one of the world's leading Egyptologists for the Delta area of Egypt, where the Israelites live. When I first interviewed him in 2002, I asked him if there was any evidence for the Israelites, and he said, so far, not. And that was when I basically came home and had my crisis of faith. In the next film on Red Sea Miracle Part 1, I meet again in Jerusalem, Manfred Bitek, and he has exciting new information to give me. And this is where he starts telling us about, in his dig sites, he started uncovering information about the word Goshen, as we know that
Yes.
the Israelites lived in the land of Goshen. Well, there's a lake called Geshem, and we're seeing that in the Greek and in the Hebrew, there's this combination Goshen, Geshem that's somewhat the same word. Well, there's this great big lake, and that it looks like there's a connection. He believes then, he's saying that we shouldn't discount the information of the Bible. And, you know, I wouldn't say that he was necessarily a believer. I don't know how deep his faith is, but he was basically coming to a whole other reality that there's evidence for the Israelites in Egypt, and this connection to this big lake was where the Israelites might have lived, is what he was trying to tell me.
Well, I want to give some of our listeners a chance to join the conversation. So if you'd like to join that, perhaps you've seen some of these films and maybe have a question of Tim Mahoney, feel free to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. But before I take some phone calls, let me real quickly just say that it seems to me that if I can summarize each one of the films in a short way, your, if you will, evidence and your archaeological evidence and your historical evidence all really hinge on the idea that some of these Egyptologists and others have put the, if you will, the Exodus and even the conquering of Jericho in the wrong time period. And once you move some of that time period back, all of a sudden all sorts of things begin to line up in very significant ways, which would then validate the historical accuracy of the book of Exodus. Is that fair?
Yes, in fact, so a patterns of evidence approach doesn't necessarily ask the scholars where did it, what time did it happen, because they're somewhat saying it happened at a different time than what the Bible says. So what we then looked for was, well, is there a pattern in the archaeological record that mirrors or matches the early Israelites? And that's what we're showing in these films, is a sequence of both events and archaeology that is affirming the biblical account.
And so, again, that's kind of helpful. Also, the idea of where the Red Sea is and not the Reed Sea and all of that, which is part of that first film. But let's take a break. When we come back, I want to get into maybe giving a few of you a chance to ask a question. And some of you may have seen already the Red Sea Miracle Part 2. I hope many of you have seen Red Sea Miracle Part 1. And again, we are wanting to begin to go to the website, Patterns of Evidence. And even though that is running out, I think, on Thursday, starting Friday, Friday, then Salem Now will be a place where you can watch this. And I think this is, again, something that is really encouraging, because when you think of the book of Exodus, of course, that's important not only to Christians, but to Jewish believers as well. And I see this as an opportunity, if you want to show it in your home, to invite some of your neighbors, others that have never heard of some of this before. Certainly it would be a great encouragement to young people to know that there is historical evidence for the Bible and for their faith. And so those are some reasons why we always wanted to bring Tim Mahoney on the program to talk about some of these issues. When we come back, we'll take some phone calls, 1-800-351-1212, patternsofelidence.com, and you can find out more about that. And of course, there are some great opportunities for young explorers, for homeschool, and you can, of course, obtain the various films on the Exodus, the Moses controversy, and the Red Sea miracle. So let's take a break. We'll come back and take some phone calls and continue our conversation with Tim Mahoney right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue conversation with Tim Mahoney for a few more minutes. Again, founder of Thinking Man Films. And, of course, we've talked about the Patterns of Evidence, the Exodus, Patterns of Evidence, the Moses controversy. And, of course, now Patterns of Evidence, the Red Sea miracle. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Let's head to Dallas. First of all, EJ, if you're on with Tim Mahoney.
Great, thank you. Outstanding, both movies. Really love the panel discussion. Keywords, the Lord caused an east wind, the deep waters, and the wall of waters. I have 3 questions. You give 3 locations, the Egyptian model, and then I'll call Hebrew north and south, just looking at it. But where were the 4 divers or the 2 divers that ended up seeing the wheel? Where were they? Which location was that? And when you do your next movie to Mount Sinai, where are you going to start where are you going to start the Hebrews? And is there any biblical evidence of where they were geographically?
Good. So first one, the chariot wheel in the water, and then second of all, where you're going to start the various issues of Mount Sinai. So, Tim?
Right. So the divers, the 2 divers that we have in the film that are telling us eyewitness testimony of looking and touching or seeing a chariot wheel, that was at Nueva. That was the center part of the Gulf of Aqaba at Nueva there. So that's the crossing site where they were. The question of the other question would be
Mount Sinai.
Yeah, Mount Sinai. We're going to look at all the mountains again. So we're going to probably have at least 4 to 6 mountains that we're going to be looking at. And so that means that we're going to look in the Sinai Peninsula. We're going to look at Har Karkum. We went to Har Karkum before, which is in the Negev area of Israel. We're going to look in the Saudi Arabia locations too. So we've been gathering footage about the mountain locations since 2003.
And again, I know people that have gone up on those mountains, some that we've interviewed on this program, others that more recently have been able to go up on what were seen as maybe other possible sites of Mount Sinai. And if nothing else, I think, Tim, what this kind of illustrates only so well is that when we pull out our Bibles and then we go to the maps in the back, the maps in the back aren't based necessarily on maps are not divinely inspired, I guess is a nice way to say that. And so in some respects, you've had to rework and rethink some of the assumptions that were made, sometimes by fairly liberal scholars, haven't you?
Yes, that's correct. And that has been the idea that there's traditional thought, where people have placed things, and then there's probably what I would consider more liberal thinking, which has been to diminish or minimalize the Bible. Mm-hmm. And then as we're looking at it, we're going back and saying, well, what does the biblical text say? One clue for this has to do with the ancient land of Midian. If Moses was in the ancient land of Midian, which archaeologists will tell you, they believe that it's on the northwest corner of Saudi Arabia, sort of in that area where people have considered it, which is on the east side of the Gulf of Aqaba up into Jordan. That's considered that's where the pottery and that's where the historical understandings of Midian is. So then the question is was the mountain in Midian when Moses was, with his sheep? Or did Moses go into the Sinai Peninsula or somewhere else? Those are the things we're going to be looking at next on the journey from the sea.
So again, I just think, if nothing else, you've got some of the divers' interviews and those kinds of things. But just before we run out of time, we certainly want to encourage people to watch the film. But you also have a whole section on patternsofevidence.com for young explorers and especially for homeschool. I know we have a number of listeners that are wanting to use this. Even if you don't homeschool, you can still use this to encourage your young person to see the evidence. And you've got an elementary school curriculum and a high school curriculum. And I know that's one of the desires that you have, in that you want to really strengthen the conviction that young people have about the historical accuracy of the Bible. So talk about some of the other resources besides just watching this film that could be useful in some of the homes that our listeners are actually a part of.
Well, yes, I have 8 grandchildren, myself, and 4 children, adult children that are all married. And it's really important for for our children and grandchildren to know what the arguments are that will come against them if they go off to school or into the world in general against the Bible. And so that's what Patterns of Evidence materials have been, created for. So we have Young Explorers, a homeschool curriculum that deals with the whole Exodus. That curriculum goes through elementary up into high school. We also have a book called The Evidence of Faith, which is communicating why it's important to have a historical faith. And that can be used in small groups and Bible studies. And then the films themselves are helpful if you want to sit down with your family and just show your children and give them really strong understandings of the different viewpoints that might come against our faith, and give them sort of the weaknesses in them. And I didn't set out to just sort of disprove anybody. I was just asking the question, well, give me reasons why you don't believe the Bible is true. And then I looked at those reasons, and I wasn't convinced.
Yes.
I looked at it, and I said, is that all we got there?
Is that your best argument? I've found myself saying that a few times in debates on campus over the years. Really, that's your best argument? And so in some respects, there's just some great resources for us. But just before I let you go, let's mention one more time that for people that have said, well, I haven't seen Red Sea Miracle Part 2 yet, you can go to Salem Now, or you can go to Patterns of Evidence and talk about what they need to do, because what you're providing is an opportunity for them to have access for about a week. They can show it to anyone. They can show it to their family. They could use it as a church event. They could use it as a small group study and invite people in the neighborhood. It's pretty available as long as they actually go through the steps to actually make it possible to show it either on their computer or on their television screen, right?
That's correct, yep. So patternsofevidence.com, that link is open for the next 2 days, and then we're going to salemnow.com. It's brand new. They're putting films on, and we've been very fortunate to partner with Salem. So between patternsofevidence.com for the next 2 days, and then Salem Now is where you can see it for the next few weeks. That's where the links will be for the film then.
Okay, so we'll try to put some of those links up as well. Tim, we've been involved with you since the very beginning when you were just starting out with the issue of the Exodus, and then Moses and the language of Moses and Proto-Hebraic and all of those kinds of things, and now the Red Sea Miracle. So it's been kind of a long-term relationship, and so we always are appreciative of the time that you give us here on Point of View, and look forward to the next opportunity.
Well, I really appreciate it, and I love the name of your program, Point of View. And I think that that's really what this is about, is that the evidence is there, but how has it been interpreted? And I think that it's very important for us to understand different points of view, and then that way we can have a conversation with the world and with our own family that's being influenced by the world.
So again, patternsofevidence.com. We have the link at our website, pointofview.net. Tim, thanks for being with us, and we'll see you soon.
Okay, thank you.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about addressing some of the needs of at-risk teens. This comes from an individual that is in New York and is with Youth for Christ, Daniel Sanabria, and we'll talk about that with him. And then we'll get into some other issues. We haven't talked about China yet. We haven't talked about even my Viewpoints commentary today on disavowed studies, so we'll talk about those. Get into a couple of other issues. The complete silence from the mainstream media about the churches that have been attacked. And I did mention earlier, and I think we'll get to it before the end of the program here, Twitter banning the Star of David. Oh my goodness. You just can't make some of this up. But this is the world we live in, and that's why we try to cover all of it here on Point of View. We'll take a break and be back with more right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we're going to spend some time talking about Ask Rick at-risk teens and some of the issues that we need to address there in our urban centers. And I think you will really appreciate this conversation we're going to have with an individual that works with Youth for Christ. When I lived in Connecticut, I worked with Youth for Christ. Of course, had friends that were in New York City. And Daniel Sanabria is an individual is born in New York and lives in Brooklyn with his family, and was the founder of a youth-led prayer initiative called God Belongs in My City. Actually, under his leadership, that has spread to about 80 different cities across the United States and in various countries around the world. He leads the Youth for Christ team, and actually is an individual that is going to help us understand what we can do in our local communities, and certainly support what he's doing there in New York. A graduate of King's College with a degree in business and marketing, been in full-time ministry for more than 15 years. So, Daniel, thank you so very much for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hey, how are you? Thank you for allowing me to be here.
Let's, if we can, talk about what you're trying to do right now, not only in New York City, but in a lot of major cities, really trying to provide a refuge for many of these urban teens, some of these teen parents. We have this unrest. We've had this lockdown. We've had the pandemic. As I've said before, for some people it may have been an inconvenience. For others, it has been devastating. And if nothing else, let's talk about what are some of the needs that you are trying to address right now.
I think the needs are very strong. I mean, I've been in ministry for 15 years. This is the most hectic for us because, you know, again, young people are stuck at home. They're not meant to be home all day, 24 hours a day. They're meant to explore and build friendships. And so the needs are friendships. The needs is coming together, seeing each other, fellowshipping, and we're not seeing that through our young people. So Youth for Christ in New York City, we want to do that. We want to be a part of their lives. So Zoom calls, texting them, constant conversation with them, making sure that they don't do some crazy things out there. Because you can. I mean, the violence in New York City has erupted in the last couple of months because of quarantine and many more things. And so Youth for Christ and many volunteers and local churches are trying our best to do what we have to do to connect with these young people and reach them.
Well, again, no sports, no summer camps in many cases, no church youth groups, no birthday parties, no playing football, whatever, dances, graduations, all the rest. One of the articles, Daniel, that I posted, which we talked about in the last hour, had to do with reopening the schools, and it came from an individual that served in the United States Senate, Jim DeMint in South Carolina, and now, of course, the chairman of the Conservative Partnership Institute's been in studio with us, but he just reminds us of youth deaths in the past from, 23,000 Americans under the age of 25 died from suicide, 15,000 died from unintentional injury, 5,500 from homicide. So in some respects, we're dealing with all sorts of issues that young people have always had to face, but this lockdown, the pandemic, and now some of the race protests have taken a bad problem and make it worse, right?
Absolutely. And it's sad. It's sad to see that a lot of kids that I work with are just talking to me about many different things, such as conversations in their lives and what they want to do and what they're going to do. And a lot of times I would have to, sit down with them over a call, over a conversation, and just say, hey, man, you could do this. We're here for you. They need to hear that. They need to hear that from the church. They need to hear it from individuals that they could make it through this together. They're looking for unity. They're looking for someone to come beside them and not and ask the key questions in their lives. And hey, what are you thinking? What are you saying? What are you thinking right now that we can help you with? So again, asking those key questions as kids allows them to open up, so they don't have to feel alone or think about those suicide thoughts.
I read of one thing from Youth for Christ where they're saying that some of the urban teens right now are saying things like, I'm just trying to survive. I mean, I would imagine that could be a refrain from a variety of our listeners here, but it was really poignant when I realized the kind of issues that some of these youth are facing, especially in these urban areas.
Yes. Again, we're so close, but so far. Urban, where a lot of people are on top of each other, and again, and we're trying to protect their kids are trying to protect their families. They're trying to protect the older folks, and it's a lot of pressure on them because kids could get the coronavirus, right, and they could spread it faster in the sense of, in the urban community, in the projects that we work at, a lot of these inner city kids have given to their grandparents,
yes.
And the grandparents got sick, and they're dying. And the urban community got hit so hard in New York City. The Black community, the Latino community has been so hard, and we as Youth for Christ are trying to provide whatever we can in this time of trouble. And we're seeing some real good fruit. We're seeing young people coming out more in a sense of asking the spiritual questions, asking questions that
I'm sure
they're looking at life differently. They're looking at life differently because this is life or death situation right now.
Wow. Let's, if we can, talk about, as we go to the website, and we have Youth for Christ New York City, so it's yfcnyc.org, but you don't have to remember that because we have the link on our website, pointofview.net. You've got 1,000 Friends. You've also got COVID-19 relief. A lot of our listeners would like to say, well, what can we do to support those of you on the front line, some of you Youth for Christ leaders? What way can we do to help some of these urban teens and teen parents? Can you give us some ideas and some action items?
Oh, man, you're asking an executive director to ask that question, and I'm always looking for people to support in prayer, but also financially. We're trying to do some amazing programs with kids. So we're one of our big things we're doing here in New York City is working with kids that are incarcerated, working with kids that are in jail. And we're doing that. We're doing a lot of mentoring in those areas. Before the quarantine, man, we were being consistently with kids inside the jails, consistently with kids, walking with them when they come out of jail, find them a local church, find them a local mentor. And so if you're listening, I'm looking for mentors in New York City, the tri-state area, to come alongside with us to walk with these young people. Because these young people are going back to your neighborhood. They're going back to Brooklyn, Queens, and Manhattan. And I believe every neighborhood has a Christian, or every neighborhood in New York has a church, a healthy church. These kids got to see something different. The only thing they see is the hood in their life. The only thing they see is broken homes. And I believe the church, even though we're all broken people, we are in Christ Jesus, and we're being redeemed every single day. And so these kids, you got to see that, hey, you got a family. You got a church behind you. So I'm looking definitely for mentors. I'm looking for people that would say, I can't be a mentor, but I could support you financially, We're doing a big campaign called 1,000 Friends.
Right.
1,000 people give $20 a month. That will help us so much getting mentors, training leaders, and working with churches, go inside the facility and really mentor these kids. These kids love us. They're always asking for us. One is Youth for Christ coming back.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk more about how to get involved. And if you go to our website right now, pointofview.net, click on the picture there of Daniel, you'll see visit the website, and that will give you some information. We'll come back and talk more about some of the action items, what you can do to help out. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
How should the academic world respond when a research study published in a peer-reviewed journal comes to a conclusion that you wouldn't expect? In the past, some might challenge the methodology or even consider doing a second study to see if the conclusions could be replicated. The latest tactic is to bring pressure on the researchers and their universities so they will disavow their own study. That is what happened to professors at Michigan State University and the University of Maryland who studied police shootings. They analyzed 917 fatal police shootings of civilians to test whether the race of the officer or the civilian predicted fatal police shootings. Neither did. Their study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences found that once race-specific rates of violent crime were taken into account, they found no disparities based on race. Heather McDonald cited the study in her congressional testimony and also referred to this article in some of her writings. Even though this was challenged by other professors, the two professors in their original study concluded that even under the proposed study design, there was no significant evidence of anti-black disparity in the likelihood of being fatally shot by police. Given the current climate, you can imagine the amount of pressure they have been under. Earlier this month, the authors decided to retract their paper under the excuse that its conclusions had been misused. They specifically mentioned op-eds by Heather McDonald. This retraction illustrates what's wrong with the academic world. No longer is the focus on finding the truth. Political consensus is already driving much of the research done in this country. Researchers will likely suppress any results that challenge the latest liberal progressive narrative. Truth will be set aside. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue your conversation with Daniel Sanabria for just a few more minutes. And again, he is with the New York City Youth for Christ, such a great organization. And we have a link to the website there. Let me just mention that we have a great little video that you can watch, which is about 2 minutes long. And so you can kind of click on 1,000 Friends and then see that video. So let me encourage you to watch it. Number two, it has an opportunity for you to then share it. Hit that share button. You could put it on your Facebook page, or you could put it on a Twitter feed, or send it to an individual that might want to know more about this. And again, let's, if we can, talk about some of the ministry you've had. One that you just alluded to a minute ago is the juvenile justice ministry, going into detention centers, correction facilities, group homes. And for our listeners that are in the Northeast, they could possibly be a mentor. But I think for all sorts of other listeners, they could in one way or another support you with prayer and financial support. So talk about how we can get involved in what you're doing.
Yes, thank you so much. Yeah, couple of things. Again, mentoring. We're visioning 1,000 mentors in New York City, 200 per borough, and around the tri-state area. Basically, we believe that mentoring and discipleship go hand in hand. Being the mentor to these kids, walking with them in Christ, sharing relationship with them is vital to young people in the city. We're looking at this because when a kid gets arrested in New York City, it is a 95% chance they're going back to jail. Wow. A young person in New York City. Now, a young person in New York City could have a fight, and they're going to get arrested right there. There's no summons. The system sometimes doesn't work over here well. And now A lot of things are changing in that area, the bond reform and things like that. But the idea of a young person receiving a Christian mentor, I can get a mentor anywhere. There's some good people out there in the sense of mentoring, let's do better. But a Christian mentor, reflects the importance of the soul, the physical, and the mind. I'm all about making work, getting a job, and, being a career and have, good character, all that good stuff. But a Christian mentor is about following in who you are in Christ. These kids need to know who they are in Christ. And so a mentor will help them that way. And if a kid has a mentor in New York City or across the country, a 75% chance they do not go to jail.
Wow.
So we have an opportunity, the church has an opportunity to really make an impact, but not make it like a ministry opportunity, but to do life on life. You see throughout the scripture, Jesus walked with his disciples, did life on life with them. And I think that if we can go ahead and do that with these type of young people, man, we can literally shift the system. We could shut down jails because no one's getting arrested. I believe in that. We could slow down the violence because kids are making better choices. We could like when the leaders told John and Peter, you turned the world upside down. I think we turned our world upside down in the book of Acts. So I think it's important to do that. And then we definitely need help with finances. We're raising money. We're trying to support this ministry. Doing ministry in New York City is no joke.
Oh boy.
It's tough. It is hard. It is financially. I mean, I live in my city for 38 years. Born and raised Brooklyn. I'm a New Yorker through and thin, and it is hard. But God has still provided. God has still making a way, and we're trying to cover our budget. We're trying to save New York. We try to save New York. And finances help us out big time.
Well, let me encourage people to support you. But I also wanted to ask you a question because I'm on a board of a group that has been doing mentoring in the schools, but we've had to stop that. But we've been able to sometimes do it in a virtual way. What have you had to do? Right. Because in some respects, you've had to deal with the same kind of issues, probably even more so in New York City than those of us that have been outside of the state of New York. But how have you done it? So maybe we can learn some lessons as we are trying to do some mentoring in other parts of the country.
Yeah, so you're right. Zoom, I don't know if you know about Zoom. Zoom is probably the best thing that ever happened to us. That's helped us out seeing these kids face-to-face through technology, and we thank God for that. One of the big things is for us is making a phone call. I mean, phone calls are so important. I remember in those days I had to run home to call my friend, right? I didn't have a cell phone. But making those phone calls, text messages are so important. Those little things make a difference, right? And then we do is called drive-by, the good drive-by.
Good drive-by, yeah.
The good drive-by, which is we'll stop in front of their houses. We do it maybe twice a month.
That's
we'll
good.
Stop around in front of their houses. They'll come downstairs. We're 6 feet apart, and we're just like, what's going on? We provide food for them. We say, hey, well, let's have lunch together from a distance. And they love it. You know what I'm saying? They love just you coming out of your own way to come to Harlem or to come to the Bronx or to come to downtown Brooklyn. Just to meet them, that's huge. And so we have like 4 or 5 people joining us in that drive-by, and we're just like, hey, what's going on? And some of these kids are like, you came all the way for us? Like, yeah, we love you guys. Like, you really, we deal with some kids that are actually running away. And they're living in other people's homes, and we find out where they live, and we're drive by and where they live, and they're coming out and they, how did you find me? We're like, well, we searched for you because we love you, we want the best for you, and we've seen some amazing growth and trust. I got a call, not too long ago, a young girl, just wanted to talk, just wanted to have a conversation. You know why? Because she knows we love her. And she has no mom in her life. She has no father in her life. She's 18 years old, just turned 18. She go to court today at 3:00. And we're just, it's just that type of mentor. You got to do beyond what you're doing. What you're doing right now, mentoring, do it at a different level. Go to a different level. And again, I'm taking risk every day coming outside in New York City and not trying to get that coronavirus. I don't want it. No one wants it. But at the end of the day, these kids need to see your love for them and your love that would change their lives.
Very
so that's
good.
what we're doing.
Let me just mention, since you mentioned Zoom, there is an opportunity tomorrow, Thursday, July 23rd, for people to participate in a 1-hour Zoom chat as you go through kind of the mission and passion of Youth for Christ there in New York. It's Thursday at 7 p.m. I'm assuming that's Eastern, so then it'd be like 6 o'clock Central, 5 o'clock Mountain, 4 o'clock Pacific, since we broadcast across the nation, and I guess even 3 o'clock for our friends in Alaska. So what you have is an opportunity for people, if they have access to Zoom, to actually watch and see some of the things that you have. So I just thought we would mention that opportunity as well. And most importantly, if people would like to be participating in one way or another, we have a link to, again, Youth for Christ New York City, and it's YFC for Youth for Christ, and it's NYC for New York City. .org, but you don't have to remember all that because we have that link on our website. So, Daniel, thank you so very much for the faithful ministry that you have in New York City, and thank you for giving us some time today here on Point of View to talk a little bit more about that so we can pray for you and hopefully support you financially.
Thank you so much, my friend. I really appreciate it.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to focus a little bit of time and attention on a couple of issues in the news. And if you found yourself saying, well, wait a minute, I want to know a little bit more about some of the topics you've been addressing. Again, we have the link for Tim Mahoney there, the Red Sea Miracle and Patterns of Evidence. If you want to connect up with Daniel and what is happening there at Youth for Christ, we have that link there as well. And as you go to the website, you're going to find all that information, but you'll also find something else, and that is my Viewpoints commentary today is entitled Disavowed Study. And the reason I wanted to talk about this is it's almost like the self-cancel culture again. And that is what is usually happening in the past. If sometime a research study comes out with a conclusion that you don't expect, then some people might challenge the methodology. They might even consider doing a second study to see if the conclusions can be replicated. But the latest tactic is simply to bring pressure on the researchers and the university to disavow their own study. As hard as it is to believe, that's exactly what happened to some professors at Michigan State University, University of Maryland, published proceedings in the National Academy of Sciences, and found that there was no racial difference in the way in which fatal police shootings played out. Once you began to take into account specific rates of violent crime, there's no disparity there, which, of course, is just contrary to what you've heard from the Black Lives Matter movement and liberal progressives and all the rest. And because Heather McDonald sometimes is quoted from that, she has been on this program and is a fellow with the Manhattan Institute and wrote a book called The War Against Cops, they finally said, you know what, we're just going to pull our study. We stand by the research, but at the same time, we're going to just disavow our study because they brought so much pressure on us. And I think it's a good illustration of how today political consensus is driving a lot of the research. And now you might even start seeing people suppressing the results simply because of that pressure. So that's my commentary today. You can read it at pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
2020. It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. I wasn't necessarily planning on talking about China, but of course the events in the news have focused a lot of attention on China. And in particular, it has to do with the fact that the United States has ordered China to close its diplomatic consulate in Houston and really has been citing a nationwide pattern of espionage and attempted theft of scientific research by the Chinese military, which has been aided by the diplomats there. Now, let me give you some background. We have, of course, an embassy in Washington, D.C., a Chinese embassy in Washington, D.C., and then we have what are called consulates in various parts of the country. I think there's 7 consulates, and the one in Houston is in a pretty strategic place, if you think about this, if you're Chinese, and if you're part of the Chinese Communist Party, because that consulate then puts you in proximity to NASA, the oil and gas industry, kind of high-tech industry, all sorts of things which could be used effectively to aid the Chinese Communist government. So the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, the other day, who was in Copenhagen, Denmark, said that Chinese citizens have been stealing intellectual property for some time. That's not anything new. As a matter of fact, remember back in 2015, this is 5 years ago, all the people that made fun of then candidate Donald Trump for talking about the dangers of China. They actually said he's so obsessing about China that there's a video, which I think you can still see on YouTube, where they just they just show him saying China, 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 again and again and again. Everybody's having so much fun about the candidate Donald Trump, who will never be president, making such a big deal about China. Turns out who was right about all of that. And again, Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State, said, we're setting out clear expectations as to how the Chinese Communist Party is going to behave. And when they don't, we're going to take actions to protect the American people, protect our secrecy and security, our national security, and also protect our economy and jobs. And one of the other assistant secretaries of the State Department for East Asia and Pacific, David Stilwell, put it this way. He said the People's Liberation Army has been sending students both overtly and otherwise to American universities to study things to advance their own warfare advantages in the economic world and the rest. We took a practical step to prevent them from doing that. And as I shared with you the other day when we were talking about China, that there is a requirement that students are actually supposed to be an arm of the Chinese government. And so we've had hundreds of thousands of Chinese students come over here over the years. And for you to say, well, I can't believe that they're all agents. Well, no, maybe not. But just again, think about this. If you are a student in China and you want to study in the United States, who's going to have to let you go? Well, that'd be the Chinese Communist Party. Do you think they're going to send over people here that aren't going to be favorable towards them? I think you know the answer to that. And, of course, just the other day, I pointed out the fact that the more we hear about China, the worse it gets, because we had just the other day my evidence that I mentioned that the FBI Director Christopher Wray actually did a very shocking presentation this month in which he mentioned that nearly half of the FBI's current counterintelligence cases are focused just on China. And so these counterattacks, the predatory practices, and what he called economic espionage, which is kind of the issue we're talking about right here, he said has resulted in one of the largest transfers of wealth in human history. Then you have, of course, Mike Pompeo, who I just quoted a minute ago, but he just a few days ago was warning the Chinese leaders to back down from their military actions in the South China Sea and said that the world will not allow Beijing to treat the South China Sea as its maritime empire. America stands with our Southeast Asian allies and partners to protecting their sovereign rights to offshore resources. And then, of course, the Attorney General, William Barr, has not only been critical of the Chinese government, but also of many of these big tech firms and even Hollywood, and even singled out Disney and some of those that have done that as well. And then, of course, I mentioned just the other day that a new book out by Daniel Blumenthal, but he and Nicholas Eberstein have written a column in which they argue that the Chinese Communist Party is far more powerful today than it was in Mao's time. So those were all some things that we've talked about in the past, but then coming over the wire today was a piece by Ryan Saavedra. China forces Christians to renounce faith, destroy Christian symbols, or be cut off from welfare. And that is, again, we're not talking about the Chinese people, who are wonderful people, but the Chinese Communist Party is forcing people of faith to renounce their beliefs and to replace religious symbols and imagery with portraits of Chairman Mao and President Xi Jinping. This comes from a publication of the U.S. State Department in which it describes an online magazine on religious liberty and human rights and goes into some of the details. Here are just a few. A few months ago, communist officials in one of the provinces reportedly called officials from all the local towns and villages together for a meeting, and then the participants were ordered to remove crosses, religious symbols, and images from the homes of any person of faith who receives any kind of social welfare payment, and instead replace those with portraits of Chairman Mao and President Xi Jinping. The officials were instructed to annul the subsidies to anyone who actually protested the order. Then you have a member of the church that told a publication that the communist officials tore down religious writings, a calendar of Jesus in his home, and replaced it with a picture of Mao, who, by the way, was the most murderous dictator in world history. Then another communist official reportedly told a person that impoverished religious households can't receive money from the state for nothing. They must obey the Communist Party for the money that they receive. So this is pressure being brought on them. And another preacher from a house church received a visit from local officials where they removed a cross and images of Jesus from his home and posted a portrait of Chairman Mao. And so, again, the focus here has been on primarily the Christians, but you don't want to ignore what has happened to the Muslims because, again, you have China's treatment of these Muslims, which has included being taken into concentration camps and being subjected to forced labor. And so you're starting to see all sorts of different things being reported. Here is one report that comes from the Washington Post in which the statements were, Jesus Christ won't drag you out of poverty or cure your illness, but the Chinese Communist Party will. So take down those pictures of Christ and put up pictures of President Xi Jinping. And that, according to the Washington Post, is what thousands of villagers in southeastern China were told by local officials in really what is becoming kind of a sign of a growing cult of personality. So we're just going to have to recognize that China has really demonstrated itself as being quite an enemy of the world. And I love what Bill Gertz says. He's got this new book out called How China's Communist Party Made the World Sick. And he points out that really you don't even have to know much more than what has happened with the coronavirus, in which they lied about it, actually threatened to remove virologists if they were to go public about the fact that it could actually be transmitted from one human to the next. And so he documents that in some detail. And just a minute ago, I talked about all these Chinese nationalists. About 370,000 Chinese nationals have come to this country. And so if you look at the work by Brian Kennedy in his book, Communist China's War Inside America, he reminds us that there is in China what's called the National Intelligence Law, which requires any citizen should support, assist, and cooperate with the state intelligence work. So Brian Kennedy puts it this way: in a sense, it is quite literally the law that all Chinese students in American universities are essentially agents or at least potential agents of the Chinese Communist Party and part of the intelligence apparatus of PRC, which, of course, is the People's Republic of China. So we're learning more and more every single day about the danger that China might actually pose. And I just thought one more time I would bring that up, especially when next week the NBA is going to start having their games, and you are not going to hear one person in the NBA criticizing China, because as we pointed out just the other day, they're so dependent upon Chinese viewers that they will turn a blind eye to all sorts of human rights abuses. But then they'll, on the other hand, be quite willing to tell you all the reasons why America is such an evil country. They'll wear all sorts of logos, but there'll be things like Black Lives Matter. You won't see a logo that says Free Hong Kong or Free the Muslims in concentration camps. Anyway, we'll take a break. Be back with more right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. I thought I'd just end by talking a little bit about kind of the anti-Christian bias that you see in the press, and even kind of the anti-Semitic bias that you see in social media. And it is amazing to me when we look at how the press decides what they will or will not cover. And Gary Bauer put it this way. He said, the left silence about these rash of attacks against churches, most of of them, by the way, Catholic churches, is pretty striking because, after all, you can imagine if the same kind of attack was on, I don't know, a Planned Parenthood clinic or a variety of other things, it would be front page. And I have said before, some of you may only know about some of these attacks on these churches by listening to Point of View, and it is amazing. But let's, again, just go to what Gary Bauer has said, because he said, I've been struck by the silence of many on the left, including most of the media, amid a rash of attacks against Catholic churches over the last 10 days. Catholic churches across the country have been targets of arson, vandalism, and destruction of religious statues. Most recently, a satanic symbol was painted on the door of a historic church in New Haven, Connecticut. By the way, I didn't even know about that one. Earlier, as we talked about, in San Gabriel, California, a fire gutted the interior of the centuries-old San Gabriel Mission Church. In Florida, a man crashed a minivan through the door of a conservative Catholic church, then lit the interior ablaze while parishioners prepared for morning mass. With each attack, he says, it's become clear that the verbal threats of far-left protesters in recent weeks against churches were more than empty words. They were a call for destructive action. So Gary Bauer points out that as the commissioner of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, I've tried to draw, if nothing else, attention to the danger that these attacks on places of worship pose to the future of society where such attacks are taking place. Now, sadly, we're experiencing them here. Attacks on places of worship are often precursors to attacks on worshipers themselves. But other than conservative and local outlets, the media has largely ignored them. And he says, shame on those who have remained silent. He says, evangelical churches don't appear to have been targeted, at least not yet. But they have been in the past, so have synagogues, and I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. So don't be deceived. The radical forces that have been unleashed will come after all of us unless they are stopped. Men and women of faith must remember the wise words of Ben Franklin, who said that if we don't hang together, most assuredly we will hang separately. Of course, he meant that in a literal sense as well. But it has been striking to me how little coverage has been given to some of these attacks on churches. And again, let me ask the question. If these attacks on federal buildings in places like Seattle or Portland or other places, or attacks on churches in places like Connecticut and Florida and California and a variety of other places, if those had happened to other institutions, for example, an attack on a Starbucks or Planned Parenthood clinic or a variety of others, Democratic headquarters, you can imagine how this would be covered, wire to wire, covered all 24/7, hardly gets a mention in the media. And if nothing else, one of the reasons why I hope you'll be listening to Point of View. But, one of the things that Gary Bauer mentioned is not just in churches, but synagogues. I've got this booklet that we produced not so long ago on anti-Semitism. And I've said more than once, almost need to come up with a volume 2 because so much has happened since we published it. But the point we were making at the time is that anti-Semitism is exploding. When you hear individuals, and you're going to hear this during the Democratic convention, you might even hear it in the Republican convention, when you hear some of the candidates talking about the fact that hate crimes are on the increase, what they oftentimes fail to tell you is about half of those hate crimes are anti-Semitic. And some of the Democrats themselves, some of their leaders have actually been involved with some of that. And so these are really kind of sad commentaries on this as well, because this is a growing problem. And the FBI reports an increase in anti-Semitic assaults, accounting for more than half of all the reports. Anti-Semitic incidents on college campuses jumped significantly a few years ago. And while we're looking at the problem, it's worth mentioning that Jews only make up about 1.8% of the population. You have not only this happening in this country, but I've also documented in this little booklet how Jewish people in 8 different nations around the European Union were asked if they felt safe, and they did not, and whether they were thinking about immigrating You would think they would go from there probably to Israel, and you had very high percentages in countries ranging from France to Hungary consider emigrating because of their anti-Semitic experiences. So anyway, anti-Semitism is kind of on the rise, and this is one of the reasons why some people have said maybe it's time to leave Twitter and go to Parler. I've not gone to Parler. Maybe you have, and maybe when we open up the phones tomorrow, you can talk about your experience, pro or con, in that regard. But now Twitter is locking the accounts of users who display the Star of David in their profile image or header because Twitter has deemed the Star of David as a hateful imagery. Can you make this up? I mean, this is just amazing stuff. And again, the London-based nonprofit Campaign Against Anti-Semitism said several Twitter users have contacted them recently to report that their accounts had been locked because various images of the Star of David violated the social media's platform of rules against posting hateful imagery, which I think is just amazing, because if there's any hate, it's going the other direction. But again, let me just read what Twitter has written. Quote, this is from Twitter. You may not use hateful images or symbols in your profile image or profile header. As a result, we have locked your account. So again, you have now the Post reported offending images range from a white Star of David in a graffiti style to the superimposition of the modern blue star on the flag of Israel, spliced with yellow star Jews that were forced to wear it by the Nazis, or in a montage of yellow stars. Stephen Silverman, Director of Investigations and Enforcement for the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, said social media companies often claim that they lack the resources to tackle hate on their platforms. But Twitter has put a lie to that claim by demonstrating that it does have the resources, but chooses to target the benign symbol of a victimized minority instead of the countless racists who use the platform with impunity. He went on to say Twitter must immediately restore these accounts, apologize to the owners, and pledge finally to take robust action against the anti-Semites whom it has enabled for so long. Maybe that has happened since we've been on the air, but if nothing else, you can see that there are all sorts of very horrible kinds of things. One is kind of the hashtag Jewish privilege. If you have not seen that out there, the idea that indeed these are dangerous people. Hashtag Jewish privilege is running the slave trade, owning slave ships, owning the cotton plant, none of which, of course, was true. And just the anti-Semitic bias, which we're seeing now in social media, and we've seen in some of the leadership, even in Congress, is of great concern. So if nothing else, my booklet on anti-Semitism is available to you, as we always make it available to you. And if nothing else, just a reminder that this kind of hate is alive and well, sadly, in the United States. And it's not surprising because we've seen it, in some respects, imported from other countries. That's all we have for today. We have a lot of really good interviews coming up in the next couple of days. And, of course, we'll have our Friday weekend edition. Kelly Shackelford and Dr. Merrill Matthews will be with us, and we'll get into some of the medical issues as well. So I hope that you'll join us. If you want to get some of the information we've been talking about today, it's all available at our website, pointofview.net. I want to thank Andrew, Ivy, and Steve for their help behind the scenes. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.